Goedenavond, bonsoir, good evening to all of you. My name is Dirk Vermaelen. I am the artistic director of EUROPALIA, and on behalf of our festival, I am happy to welcome you here at Ghent University and also online at the start of our event, Trains and Tracks in Africa. This project is part of EUROPALIA Trains and Tracks, a special edition of our artistic festival focusing on the thematic of railways, which we started to develop more than 2 years ago now in order to come to the multidisciplinary program, which started on 14 October, already 5 months ago. Now, during the very first brainstorm on how to shape the program and how to present, what to present, an extraordinary series of paintings came immediately to mind. 12 paintings of the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris, depicted by Claude Monet. They are impressionist masterpieces, a possible starting point to explore the train, its speed, its glory and forms, which would inspire many other artists after Monet. The Gare Saint-Lazare paintings also reflect Haussmannian Paris and the then trendy neighborhood of the Pont de l'Europe. They are set in 1877, celebrating the new modern European society. A modernity, however, partly financed, shaped, and built with resources coming from colonial Africa, soon to be even more radically exploited by the construction of these very same railways. This construction of the railways in Africa had an enormous impact on the entire continent at the end of the 19th century and still has so today, as we will witness later on today and tomorrow. It was for our festival indispensable to also go deeper into this impact, resulting in the exhibition that we open here today, in the series of conferences here at Ghent University and tomorrow at the AfricaMuseum in Tervuren, and in the ongoing residencies at WIELS and at the AfricaMuseum. Trains and Tracks in Africa has thus the intention to look into infrastructures and mobilities in Africa, both in the past and today, through a dialogue in which artists and researchers come together, inviting you, the public, to join and further open up perspectives. Very quickly, in our search for people to carry this project, we came upon our curators, Anne Wetsi Mpoma, Johan Lagae, and Robby Fivez. Anne Wetsi Mpoma is an art historian, author, and the founder of Wetsi Art Gallery, working especially with marginalized artists while building necessary lacking bridges with institutions. And I grasp the opportunity to thank you for your devotion throughout the whole process and your input on all levels. You greatly accompany the artists in residency at WIELS and at AfricaMuseum, Alexandre Kyungu Mwilambwe and Arnaud Makalou, and we absolutely look forward to your different interventions. Johan Lagae is at home here at Ghent University as a professor of 20th century architectural history, doing research for a few decades now, and publishing on colonial and post-colonial architecture and urban history in Africa. It is his ongoing research on railway infrastructure in Africa with the students from the Department of Architecture and Urban Planning that was the starting point of this project. Johan, we are immensely grateful to you for your continuous passion and input, and often ask ourselves when you take the time to sleep. We look forward to your introduction on your ongoing research in a few moments, presented together with Robby Fivez, PhD candidate and assistant here at Ghent University at your department. Robby, thank you very much as well for your important role as research curator with Johan, and we are also looking forward to your intervention. Before your talk on your research, you will both in a moment also introduce the exhibition Borders, Mobilities and Landscapes, Mapping Railway Infrastructures in Post-Colonial Africa. This exhibition here at Van den Hove and I thank the team in charge of the venue, is an exhibition with and by your students and an integral part of this project reflecting ongoing research. Congratulations to the students for their involvement and for the outcome. Johan and Robby, I will also let you further introduce Geert, Castryck and Chao, Tayiana, Maina, and their respective keynote lectures for tonight. I warmly thank all tonight's lecturers, as well as tomorrow's lecturers, researchers, as well as artists, part of whom are amongst us here tonight. We look forward to all of your interventions. My EUROPALIA colleague Eva Bialek will further introduce tomorrow's program and team interview in her role as coordinator of this project. Eva is, without any doubt, the person we have to thank for the flawless coordination of this project. I think, Eva, we were happy to be able to present 3 of Monet's Gare Saint-Lazare paintings as part of our opening exhibition, but we are at least as happy to host this event, Trains and Tracks in Africa, in our program as a starting point for further debates, research, actions and collaborations between artists and researchers. I hope you have all found the program book, which is on the desk there in front of you. Also online, it can be found, in which you can find further details on the talks and on the contributors. Thank you all for your presence and participation, and I hope to see you tomorrow as well in Tervuren. There are some places left, so do not hesitate to join us. I now give the floor to Johan and Robby.
Okay, thank you, Dirk, for this opening. I'm going directly to jump into the topic for sake of time. We have a long evening in front of us. So what we will do, Robby and I will introduce this exhibition of student work, which is entitled Borders, Mobilities and Landscapes. And what I will do in this first minutes is basically give you kind of the prehistory of this project. So where does this interest in railways in Africa actually come from? So as Dirk said, I'm working for several decades. I'm not that old, but old enough to have at least 2 decades of research on this topic behind me. And so what I've been doing, so I did a PhD on colonial architecture and basically looking at what Belgian architects built overseas. It was, you could say, kind of quite conventional architectural history research, which then later became influenced with insights from post-colonial theory. But in the course of the last 2 decades, I've been navigating between several fields of interest, going from colonial built heritage, colonial photography, doing exhibitions. And so this is very much part of a kind of ongoing quest, I would say, of an interest in the African continent. And so part of this like explorations that we've did over the last 2 decades basically led us to all of a sudden see the potential of the railroad in Africa as a kind of key focus of part of what we do. And so why is it so important to look at this railroad? It's almost impossible not to think of the railroad if you talk about the Belgian colonial enterprise in Central Africa. You have this famous dictum of Stanley, which said without the railroad, Congo would not be worth 1 penny. And so there is this kind of boutade of the railroad connection between what you have Matadi and the Stanley Pool, where you have Kinshasa. That part of the Congo River, you cannot navigate with boats. So it was really crucial to bypass that part with a railroad in order for the whole extractive economy of the colonial enterprise to be possible. So if you want to harvest resources in the inland and you want to bring them to the metropole, that railway line is a crucial kind of connection. And so that's one of the first big projects, infrastructural projects of the late 19th century. And so it's really impossible to think even of cities like Matadi and Kinshasa without taking that connection into account. Because basically a lot of the cities in colonial Congo were actually transfer nodes within a kind of economic network. And so Matadi and Kinshasa were basically places where the fluvial network intersected with the railroad network. And it was that interconnection that made it possible to make the colony thrive in economic terms. So that really fascinating trajectory, which is about 400 kilometers long in the what is called the Bakongo region, was something that was always a bit in the back of my mind when I started my PhD, but it was never really at the forefront. And so how did it come actually to something that we are looking at and which we worked on with students? It has to do with this fact that in colonial propaganda, it's a very omnipresent kind of episode. So it's this heroic narrative of Belgian ingenuity that challenged this extreme topography of that very difficult region, especially around the Matadi area. It's a very tough region in terms of topography to build a railroad. So there was this whole discourse on the heroic enterprise that was successfully ended at the end of the 19th century and which was celebrated way into the 1950s. So the book that you see, La Bataille du Rail, is one of these iconic sources of the late 40s, which was reprinted a couple of times in the 50s. And the cover in itself is already a very telling image of how that enterprise was, on the one hand, Belgian ingenuity and the labor of the African labor force. But what about mortality rates? What about the huge devastating impact of depopulation in the region? Those are things that always remain in the margin. Okay, so when I started doing my research, I was really very much focused on cities. I worked a lot on Lubumbashi, worked a lot on Kinshasa, worked a lot on Matadi. And as I said, it's impossible to understand these cities without taking the railroad into consideration. So if you look at Kinshasa and look at one of the first plans, it really says it all. What you basically see, the first plan of Kinshasa is basically an economic diagram. It's trade posts along the edge of the Congo River, which then are connected via these railroads to the Gare de Ndolo, from where the train leaves to Matadi. So we're talking really late 19th century. This is what Kinshasa is. It's a transfer hub for resources. And so you can actually do research, and we've done that a couple of years ago in a seminar with students. If you basically start to investigate the development of the urban form of Kinshasa, it's actually quite interesting to see how the inner city railroad starts to shift, how it's actually relocated a couple of times, and how it is connecting new nodes of economic productivity. So that's one of the researches that we've done. And what is of course interesting that today you can see these traces of this inner railroad system, which have become obsolete in a certain sense. So you could say it's failed infrastructure. Anthropologists would say, well, it's not really failure, it has become something else. And so this is what is really what interests us. So how you can make these connections between past infrastructures and how they work today. If you look at Matadi, it's very similar. So and it's actually the same of this, really the same year. So the first plan of Matadi, what you basically see, La Gare, you can see the railroad. So that's the backbone of the whole system, and it's dissecting the territory into concessions. So it's really an economic creation, with the village and the Kinkanda being not part of the urban territory, very interestingly. So that one, I don't know if this is a pointer, yes it is. So this one area is not part, it's like it's the village. And so we keep that village that exists out of the scheme. And so we've been, I mean, there's a book, there's an historical atlas on Matadi, which will be launched anytime soon. I've been saying this for like 10 years now, but it should be out there in like a year and a half, I hope, because we've done all the research and we have all the material. So we basically looked at how you have basically a port infrastructure, which was at the heart of the origin of the city, which then became a booming port city in the 1920s, 30s, where there was a kind of modernity that people compared to the kind of vibrancy that you had in the port of Antwerp. But it's also very much a labor reservoir. So it's a place where a huge amount of people coming from regions, sometimes very far away, are attracted and recruited and basically brought to the city to make that economic machine work. And so what we're interested in as architects and spatial planners is, of course, where do these people live? How do they navigate the city? So one of the things that is for us really interesting in Matadi is how does this model of the segregated city, so a binary city in which the European part of the city is really divided from the so-called city indigène, so the African part of the city with the buffer zone. So how does that work? I don't have time to explain it in detail. It would take me 3 hours. But what is essential here is that you have a scheme. And that's why for us, the Colonial Archive is still a very important resource. It's a document of 1928 where you have a scheme hand drawn by one of the engineers who says, okay, we have the European city, we have the African city, we have La Gare et le Port, and we need a connection directly from the African city and the labor camps directly to this economic zone of the city where all these people work. So this is the theory, 1928. If you look at how that city evolved, what is quite fascinating and what is really for us like a key element in the story is that basically, okay, for this huge labor camp, this is the mobility pattern. So fine, okay, no intersection with the European city, but here, where this huge amount of people actually live, they actually cross through the city center, creating all kinds of very fascinating tensions and frictions between these two so-called separated populations. So there is this kind of zone of encounter which is not intended, which is, of course, for us an interest. So cities and railroads is something that we have been looking at. But one of the key elements, which I only started to become really interested in, let's say from 2008 to 2010, is basically what happens in between. What happens in between Matadi and Kinshasa. A small exhibition of 2008, which you will see some panels in the exhibit above, was like a first kind of attempt to trace that trajectory. But the key moment basically was this project that I was able to do together with Karel de Keyser, who is this photographer from the Magnum agency. So we basically got access to the digital collection of the Tervuren Museum. And it was that project that really confronted me heads on with the kind of devastating impact of colonialism and colonization on the existing landscape. So-called terra nullius, there is nothing there. Well, basically what these photos show you, there is something there and we've changed it. And I'm putting it in a euphemistic way. So what you basically see is that colonization is about appropriating land, taking over territories and changing them radically, bringing in the new spatial order by building missionary posts, by making this huge tract of lands and changing them into agricultural fields or plantations, creating this kind of situation. So really devastating ecological impact sometimes. So this is for me was like an eye-opener and was basically the start of, you could say, basically the project that you will see today. So this trying to understand this transformation of a landscape. So how does the existing landscape via the railroad all of a sudden turns into a productive landscape? How does that work? And so interestingly, in the photographs of the late 19th century, what you have is these iconic images of the heroic enterprise, but you also have images that show the messiness that it took to make those things. So which is really what was quite exciting in going through this immense collection of photographs. So that became the part of an assignment that two students who actually co-curated this exhibition, Jana and Finn, they basically made an atlas on this trajectory between Matadi and Kinshasa. Robby will say something more about that in a moment. So I've talked about railroads and cities, the transformation of landscapes. For me, one key element, and it's for me a key element in the whole EUROPALIA project, is what do railroads learn us about the kind of biased gaze we have had on Belgian colonial history, of the history of colonial Congo, if you want. We've been very much writing that history from a kind of Belgian Congolese kind of perspective. I'm someone who is very much influenced by the work of Jean-Luc Fellut, who is someone who actually learned me we have to look differently at these territories. And so we need to look at how these places were connected to the outside world. So we did a project in 2009. We started the project on the urban history of Lubumbashi, not looking at Lubumbashi as this kind of mining town built by the Union Minière d'Haute-Katanga, but by a mining town, by a city basically in an urban landscape shaped and made by people who came from elsewhere. People who arrived by train. And what is interesting, the train arrives in Lubumbashi in 1910, but it's not connecting Lubumbashi to the large part of the inland of Congo. It's actually connecting Lubumbashi to the south, which means that all of a sudden your gaze has to shift completely, because the people who come, who make the city basically come from places like Cape Town, come from Beira, which is in Portuguese ruled Mozambique. So we had a PhD student trying to do that. It show map basically what happens if you follow the Greek community, the Italian community that comes in, the Jewish community. So how do they shape the city and how do they help to build that urban landscape? And so it's work that we've been doing for quite a couple of years, and that was led to a couple of publications. So for me, in this EUROPALIA project, what is really crucial is that we start to see these railroads as connecting corridors that really force us to think very differently about this territory. So instead of having a map like this, where Congo is like an isolated and specific territory and a kind of gray, generic kind of landscape, I think it's much more this kind of maps that we need. It's where these connections start to really work. And so these kinds of maps, which of course are historical connections that exist from the colonial period, but basically went into the post-independence period and basically works till today. So what you see is a 2019 article of the railway line going from Katanga to Benguela, which was reanimated 2018. So these connections, of course, today are still very much at the heart of what is happening. Okay. So what you will see in the exhibit, so this is that gives you the context of where this all comes from, what we did in the exhibit. Robby will explain. One last disclaimer, what you will see above is very much focusing on using the tools of architecture students, so drawing, mapping, making new kinds of maps. But that doesn't mean that we're not interested in a larger sense. And so I'm very happy that this exhibit is part of a larger project of EUROPALIA. So having this opening evening with 2 keynote lectures and a conference, because for us, even if we are spatial experts, if you want, we're very much interested in the social history of things. So if you want to read one book on railways in Africa, I think you need to read this one. A devastating account of a social historian who talks about what it means to be a laborer coming from the southern parts of Mozambique and going in the 1930s to work in the mining compounds of Johannesburg, and how there's an everyday regime on the railway line. A devastating account. I mean, a book that really is mind-blowing. I mean, we're not only interested in railway lines in Africa. I mean, this is a fantastic book by Peter Christensen who shows that banal, very mundane infrastructures are really crucial if you want to study empires. So this kind, and then the work, you can't really see it, but it's the promise of infrastructure. So the whole literature of anthropology that looks at infrastructure as a kind of whose infrastructure are I talking about? What is the afterlife? How do people actually appropriate so-called failed infrastructure? So all that literature stuff that we like to read because it feeds us, it gives us food for thought in the work that we do, and of course artistic work as well. And so Kiripi Katambo's photograph, which for me is really a very striking image of what the poetics of infrastructure can actually be. So also that kind of dimension is crucial. And in the EUROPALIA project, I'm very happy that we have this possibility of confronting scholars with artists. Okay, so that's what I had to say. Robby is going to take over, and then I will give a thanks at the end of the talk.
So this was the introduction to the first part of the exhibition. I will now introduce the 3 remaining parts. And I will try to be a little bit briefer. So what we actually tried to do here, and what we did is to mount an exhibition with student work. So there's different parts to it: borders, mobilities, and landscapes. Of course, you can all go upstairs later on and see the exhibition more in detail and delve through it. But I will already briefly give you a sort of sneak peek and quickly guide you through the 3 main parts, apart, of course, from the explorations part, which has been discussed. The first section that I want to show is borders, and it actually zooms in onto a research seminar that we did last academic year in 2020-2021, together with students that are listed here on the slide. Some of them are here, and thank you all for joining us and for all of your hard work. And I actually wanted to start with this part because it ties in quite closely to what Johan just told about the railway as an ideal topic to study these transcolonial connections, and to study the Belgian Congo as a place that was connected to the outside world. A connection that also meant a sort of intense va-et-vient of goods, people, and ideas. And what we wanted to do in this research seminar in particular is to investigate railways not only as logistical lines of an exploitative economy, but to see them especially as lines that crossed colonial borders and hence led to certain transcolonial mobilities. And the spaces they pass through, of course, have are impacted by the presence of this railway to such an extent that you could start to read them as sort of cosmopolitan environments, even at some areas. So to that end, we actually asked our students to work on the different lines that connect Congo to the outside world, which is so this one, the Congo Océan line connecting Pointe Noire to Brazzaville. Then the Benguela line, which connects the Katanga mining area to Benguela and Lubito, the Benguela line. And then what is actually what will be discussed today as well, the Tanzanian central line, which in colonial times was called the Tanganyika Bahn, constructed by the Germans, connecting Kigoma to Dar es Salaam. And then the final one is the Southern Line, or that's how it's called often in colonial publications, which connected Elizabeth Field to the south, passing by the Victoria Falls, sort of railway node of Bulawayo, and then Beira and Southern Africa, Cape Town, mainly. The aim of this research seminar was not necessarily to work through new archival material, but rather we wanted our students to come up with new insights by trying to visualize and map the spatial impact of the railway that is often already addressed in a rather sideways way in existing published work, both colonial published sources and more recent scholarly work. And as you can see, we gave our students a sort of very long list, a very long reader of stuff they could read and they could delve through for information. But we also invited some scholars to talk about their work on their research work on these railway lines. So this is the result. I won't go into detail into all of these posters, but all of these student groups made fabulous posters. They made a sort of brief exhibition. So you will be able to see a lot of them upstairs and to read through them and find a lot of details and themes and topics that they discussed. But I actually wanted to briefly highlight one of them, as it is actually the work of the students who investigated the Tanzanian Central Line, which will be discussed by Geert today. So probably if you visit the exhibition after these opening lectures, you might be able to see some of the things Geert will be talking about visualized in these posters. So I'm anxious to see if that is actually the case, but let's see. Okay. Now, of course, because there's only so many railroads connecting Congo to the outside world, and we had perhaps too many interested students for a research seminar. We also decided to start working on this railway line that connects Elizabethville to Port Frontier, today's Ilepo, which is called the BCK railway line, the Bakongo-Katonga railway. So that's what a different group of students focused on, and of course because they couldn't really take into account this sort of transborder dimension, this transcolonial dimension that was quite present in these other projects. They focused on something else, which was actually the mobility of people, but also certain commodities like wood or food crops. This slide had to show something else. So this afternoon we had a workshop going on. But what we actually did, because one of the students who worked already on this topic during the research seminar, Johan, who's sitting over there, continues his work in his master's dissertation. And we mounted a sort of workstation for Johan where discussions can take place between people who visit the exhibition, but also guests that we invite and so on. So if you see a pile of documents there, that's not a fault of our of our setup, but that's actually the ambition. And then the final section, landscapes, shows the result of a master dissertation of 2019 by Jan van der Poele and Fien de Ruiter, who are also here. And they explicitly took the transformation of the landscape as their entry point. And they used the landscape as an analytical tool to investigate the impact of the railway between Matadi and Kinshasa. This is the work Johan already briefly mentioned earlier on. And in their work, they built on anthropologist Tim Ingold's notion, conceptualization of the landscape as, and I'm quoting, a taskscape in its embodied form, a pattern of activities collapsed into an array of landscape features. They translated this notion of the taskscape, which Ingold uses to point at this pattern of day-to-day activities that happen in the landscape. And they tried to break up this notion in 4 different scapes that all pertain to certain activities. The linescape investigates the construction and reconstruction of the line. Infrascape tries to understand the landscapes that are related to the operation of the railway. Gainscape zooms in on an enormous sugar plantation, which actually doesn't really show in this projection, but reaches all the way from the railway line to the border with Angola. And then the final part, Powerscape, investigates landscapes of electricity production, but also starts to give a sort of hint towards another infrastructural network that could be of interest as a sort of motor of transformations of landscape. Of course, I will not go into detail to each of them. But I will briefly highlight the infrascape because it was very close to my my heart, and also because it's what this or it's the part where this mapping was produced for. This is a map of the building stock of the Ultraco, so the colonial transportation company. And it maps out the complete all of the buildings that were owned by the company, and it shows that such a railway line, of course, extends beyond the sort of pristine line in the landscape. So it's a whole landscape of operation that is underneath. The drawing was actually based on an existing archival document from the Otraku archives kept in Kinshasa. And this plan was really fundamental for us to get a grip of this infrastructural landscape because it displayed the whole building stock of the Office de Transport Coloniaux, but also because it served as a sort of drawn inventory through which we could geographically locate smaller plans of labor camps, housing typologies, railway stations, or factories within this landscape. Now, it is only by redrawing these plans and connecting building typologies to the bigger picture that we could start to get a grip of this infrascape, and that we could start to understand how these different places worked and looked like. And for instance, this small location on the 216th kilometer of the line, Kiazi Kolo, suddenly became important as a production site of crushed stone that was used as ballast underneath the railway tracks. And by zooming in, we can see how Kiazi Kolo was actually completely transformed due to the presence of this railway infrastructure, and how landscape fragments like the mining pits, the stone crushing plant, or the segregated structure of the African and the European areas still testify to how daily life in such a railway locality must have been. In the dissertation of Jana and Fien, all these scapes are brought together into an atlas of the Matadi-Kinshasa Railway, which you can also see upstairs. And in the exhibition, you will be able to delve deeper into their work and into each of these scapes. So I'm coming to the end. I hope that this sort of brief sneak peek already sparked an interest, and that all of you will enjoy the exhibition, which you can visit upstairs after the opening lectures. I will now give the floor to Johan again for a word of thanks, I guess.
Yeah, maybe I will do the thanks at the end, if I not forget. But I think, and for time, I think it would be good that we basically go directly to the keynote of Geert Castryck, because I can change the, let me change quickly the stop sharing. Open the other share. Okay, it's definitely okay. Screen. So this is not you. This is you, and I'm giving already something away which I shouldn't have given away. Sorry, Geert. Well, one has to tease his audience, no? Okay, so let me share this. Share full screen. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Brief introduction to Geert. So I'm very happy that Geert is here. Basically, because one really very good exercise of the seminar last year was done on the line between Kigoma and Dar es Salaam, and it's really thanks to Geert, who at a quite late stage actually in the seminar basically said that he was willing to talk to our students, and all of a sudden started to tell about his fascinating research that he was doing, and then students were actually able to try and map and visualize the kind of dynamics he will actually talk about today. So to briefly introduce Geert, Geert is a historian who graduated at Ghent University, but is now, and he's a specialist in African and global history, did a PhD on the Muslim community in Bujumbura, Burundi, but is now affiliated with the University of Leipzig, where he's at the Leipzig, and I have to check, Leipzig Research Center of Global Dynamics, which in my point of view is one of the most exciting research units thinking about the global condition and its spatial dimensions. So I think the work that they are doing, the kind of theoretical conceptualization of what it means for the world to become global, I think they're really very innovative, and I'm particularly fascinated by how Geert brings those kind of theoretical concepts to fascinating empirical work that is based on archival work, but also on field work. So I'm very much looking forward here to what is definitely going to be a very fascinating lecture, which is also important because what Geert is going to teach is that if we want to talk about the railways in Africa, we need to see them in a much longer durée. So history doesn't start with colonization, basically. So that's why I think it's really important to have this talk as part of the opening evening of this EUROPALIA Tracks and Trains in Africa event. Geert, the floor is yours. If you're thirsty, there is water in the bottle.
Good evening, everybody here in the room and behind the screens at home or wherever they are. Okay, this looks like that. First of all, I would like to thank Johan for the kind introduction, but also for the invitation, Robby and Eva for the organization. And it's a pleasure to be back in Ghent, but it's also an honor that I can give the first lecture of this conference on trains and tracks in Africa. with as a subtitle, a dialogue on infrastructure and mobilities in Africa. And I want to take up this idea of dialogue by telling you a brief history of connection and disconnection in the area between the Indian Ocean and East Congo, using the Tanzanian Central Line as a common thread running through this history. So the dialogue, therefore, is one of entanglement between the railway and this area over the past century and a half. So I want to go not just tell the history of a railway, but I want to take you on a journey through the history of a region, linking it to the railway. In the course of this 40 minutes that I have, I think, when did I start? In the course of these 40 minutes that I have, I will talk about different elements. This is not really an outline of what I will tell, but these are the elements that will be touched upon. I will look at historical precedents and spatial context for the railway and the history of that region. I will hint at the influence of technology and of environment. I will talk about colonization and about decolonization, also about labor, migration and settlement, about decay of the railway and becoming heritage, and also about connections on different scales. This relates also to what Johan said, inspired by Jean-Luc Vellut, that the scale has to go beyond the space that is covered by the railway itself. So it includes crossing borders, but it also includes moving away from the railway. So this is also an element of scale. Before I move on to tell this story of communities and cities, of continuities and changes, of chances, but also of crises along this central line, let me briefly first situate the railway itself. So this was a picture taken in August 2011, which was when I traveled from Dar es Salaam to Kigoma on that train. At first, when the railway was completed in the context of the colonial protectorate of German East Africa in 1914, it's not unimportant, the central line, or Zentralbahn as the Germans called it, connected Dar es Salaam on the Indian Ocean coast with Kigoma at Lake Tanganyika. So, Dar es Salaam, Kigoma. So this is the central line built by the Germans, or built by Africans, but on German initiative. As you can see also on this map, later on, there's no dates on it, but later on, several branches were added to this line, either connecting with other railway lines, like here, linking the central line with the Tanga Arusha line, or linking with other destinations, like this important branch linking the central line to Lake Victoria and on top of Lake Tanganyika. There has also been plans for further branches. For instance, there were concrete plans to add a line to Rwanda, branching off here, which is now again on the table, but which have not yet been implemented. However, as I already mentioned, it is not my intention to tell you the history of the railway, but rather to use the railway as an entry point, or as I put it in the title, as a prism that can be used to diffract the manifold colorful stories surrounding and connected to this railway track. On the one hand, this railway story reflects what happened in and to that area. The railway as a narrative intervention from my side, only reflecting things that happened in that area. But on the other hand, the railway also had an impact on the area, redefining social and spatial relations along the track. The railway had an impact on people and on places in the area, redefining their connections and their opportunities on all conceivable scales, from the very local to over territorial, regional to global. Some localities and some people won in this process, were profited from this process. Others suffered a comparative disadvantage by being too far removed from this artery of regional or global connection, or by not having access to it for other reasons. The railway itself also had its ups and downs, its comparative disadvantages as a railway compared to other infrastructural connections. For instance, you see here a little bit of the railway line linking Kalemi, Albertville in colonial times to the Congolese railway network Johan and Robby talked about. This linked this central line to the riches, the mineral riches, the plantation production of the Congo. But Congo had, as Johan already showed, and Robby, alternative connections to the Atlantic Ocean and to the Indian Ocean and to South Africa, which became, or staying on the Congolese territory, which for several reasons became more interesting, more attractive, cheaper, faster, more efficient, whatever different reasons apply to different alternatives than the connection through Tanzania or Germany, East Africa or Tanganyika. The railway also had its comparative disadvantages in relation to dynamics on the world markets. Sometimes produce that was shipped along this line became less coveted on the world markets, also being a relative disadvantage for this central line. But also in relation to successive political orders or disorders, which sometimes made areas where goods came from, who might have been in crisis or in a situation of war, not accessible anymore or less accessible, which also affected the railway activities. Also constraints relating to maintenance or technological evolutions that made the technology used along this railway line less up to date. So there are different lacking budgets. So there are different elements that also negatively affected the operation of this railway. So this railway is not one constant thing that has been there for over 100 years. This railway itself has its history as well, influenced by surrounding factors, but also influencing surrounding factors. This may all seem quite abstract so far, so please allow me to flesh this out. And I start the story, as Johan already said, even before the train was built, the railway was built, even before the first train ran on the African continent on a whole, or as a whole. For your information, the first train in Africa was in Alexandria in 1852. So I start my story before that. And in order to understand the dialogue between railway and region, we need to understand in which spatial and historical context it has been constructed. The railway did not create connections out of thin air, but rather enhanced and to some extent redirected pre-existing connections. The railway was built after the colonial defeat of what I call the caravan trade complex, but in fact continued the connections that were part of this caravan trade. Caravan trade, which is more notoriously known as slave trade or slave and ivory trade, but I focus on the infrastructure of that complex, which are the caravans. So incidentally, the railway on top of that, the railway actually continued to rely on porterage after having replaced the caravan trade complex, for instance, to carry goods to and from railway stations. The railway does not abolish the technique of carrying of porterage, but I will come back to that later. For now, I want to reconstruct the connections and the mobilities upon which the central line was grafted. So obviously, there were already long distance connections, mobilities, and infrastructures of transportation before European colonizers violently conquered this area in the last quarter of the 19th century. And let me start with sketching the caravan trade complex. And I call it a complex because it is more than only caravans carrying goods to and from the Indian Ocean, or the other way around, to and from Central Africa. Organizing caravans involved power relations, negotiations, violent encounters, patronage, hierarchy, provisioning food and organizing the provisioning of food, which involved plantations along the caravan routes, recruiting porters, procuring the trade goods that the caravans want to transport, patrolling trade routes to guarantee the security of the caravans, or to enforce the security of the transport. Relocating populations were a consequence of the opportunities the caravans offered, but also of the disorder the caravans caused in certain cases. So the caravan trade complex is much more than only this carrying of goods. And the same will apply. The same is true for railways, to which we will come later to understand railways. So the caravan trade complex is both infrastructure and institution, which facilitates trade and transport, but also a spatial and political order that comes along with this caravan trade complex. Inherently also involving recurrent disorder by the intrusion of this caravan trade complex. So, and this caravan trade complex did not only embed and channel connections in East and Central Africa, but was also globally connected beyond East Africa and Central Africa. For instance, both ivory and textiles, to mention the two most important trade goods in the caravan trade complex, were traded on global markets or produced on global markets. So if you look at the map, it is quite clear that the Germans built their central line on the same track where the main axis of the East African caravan trade complex had been situated. From here to here, via Tabora. But you don't see Kigoma and Dar es Salaam on this map. To note that. We can spatially read the railway track by looking at the nodes it connected. So Tabora, the place where the railway line bifurcates, now, not at the time of the Germans, but bifurcates towards either Lake Tanganyika or Lake Victoria, was at the heart of the land of the Nyamwezi. And these Nyamwezi had been the initiators of the caravan trade complex. The caravan trade complex originates not on the coast, but originates in the Nyamwezi area. There are several sources, but that's the most important origin, who are the first to actually install this complex. Long distance trade is much older, but the control over the entire trajectory, actually organizing the entire long distance from coast to interior, is something where the initiative comes from this Nyamwezi area. This is also how the Nyamwezi come into being, if you can phrase it like that. And they continue to be the main suppliers of caravan porters throughout the 19th century, or the main recruiters, the main organizers of this recruitment. Another note on the map, it's not indicated on this map. Oh, yes, it is. It's here below. It's on this enlargement. Uvinza, already quite close to Lake Tanganyika, is a source of salt, which had been a long-distance trade goods for many centuries already, and is a very important element of long-distance trade, and therefore also a stop or a hub for the caravan trade complex, and an important destination for the railway later on. The terminus, Kigoma, lies at Lake Tanganyika, which gives access to lands in the Congo, which were particularly rich in ivory in the second half of the 19th century. and as we all know, also rich in raw materials and minerals, important for the period afterwards, but already known in the late 19th century. We are here in this Great Lakes region, in one of the most densely populated parts of Africa. Yet there are only a few places, and now I come to environment, only a few places along the lake shore where you have easy access or direct access to the lake. And that is because these lakes, this Great Lakes region, this chain of lakes lie in the African Great Rift, the Great African Rift Valley. And there are often very steep slopes where human settlement is almost impossible, and where also the construction of a railway is very difficult. So this difficult access, for instance, also explains, that's why I put Jane Goodall here and her friends, this difficult access also explains why we can still find populations of free living chimpanzees nearby, despite the fact that it is one of the most densely populated parts of Africa. Most people live in the higher and healthier areas, so not on the lake shore, but the few spots that give direct access to the lake, often coinciding with the mouth of a river, became hubs for the caravan trade and sites of urbanization. And in the case of Kigoma, also the terminus of the railway. So there were not that many alternatives to access the lake, rather than choosing this area. That would have been an alternative, but these are actually the few places where you can have relatively easy access to the lake. However, if we have a closer look, we notice, I already pointed it out, that the railway station, the terminus, is not on the same spot where the caravan traders had access to the lake and where most people lived in that area. The caravan trade complex had operated via Ujiji, which is 7 kilometers south of Kigoma. Nowadays, the town has become an urban area of 300,000 people, and this is one urban area, Kigoma Ujiji, but these were two localities 7 kilometers away from each other. Ujiji is the place where Stanley found Livingstone, an iconic propaganda moment for early colonialism, or where, for the fans, Martin Heylen and Philip Goebbels met each other in 2012 in the Woestijnvest production Dr. Livingstone. The German colonizers followed the track. They followed the track of the caravan traders from ocean to lake, yet chose a different place of arrival on the lake. Here you can see it here, Dar es Salaam Kigoma versus Bagamoyo Ujiji. So the same is true for the place of departure from the Indian Ocean, where rather than departing from Bagamoyo, the main port of call for the caravan trade complex, they opted for Dar es Salaam, in this case 60 kilometers to the south of Bagamoyo. And there are two sets of reasons for these seemingly small redirections within the overall reproduction of the connections of the caravan trade complex. One is technological, the other is political. The technological reason has not so much to do with railway technology, but with the connected technology of navigation. Not only did trains replace porters, at least as far as the track itself is concerned, not to bring goods to and from the track, but at the same time, steamships or motor vessels substituted for those or other boats with shallow drafts. And whereas Ujiji and Bagamoyo have sandy beaches, see it on the top, that's a picture from Ujiji, where have sandy beaches smoothly descending in the water, Kigoma and Dar es Salaam have deeper and steeper harbors where ships with deeper draft can dock. So this clearly indicates that the central line, like the caravan trade complex before, was not only meant to connect places within Germany, East Africa, but above all to connect the water masses of the Indian Ocean with the water masses of Lakes Victoria and Tanzania, and Lake Tanganyika and later Lake Victoria. As a matter of fact, Lake Victoria was already connected to the Indian Ocean by a railway in Kenya and Uganda at the time when the Germans built their connection to Lake Tanganyika. So, to be clear, the purpose of the central line was double. It was both territorially integrating the German colony, which included rapid movement of troops when considered necessary, and gaining access to the Congo, which at the time was part of a free trade zone, according to the Berlin Congo Conference of 1884-85. But there was also a political reason for relocating the termini from Bagamoyo and Ujiji to Dar es Salaam and Kigoma. Bagamoyo and Ujiji were, we have seen it, strongholds of the caravan trade complex. They were relatively large towns of more than 10,000 inhabitants at the time, predominantly Muslim, well connected, well armed. In short, places that were not easy to subdue. And on top of that, dominated by opponents or competitors of the colonizers. The 1880s and 1890s have seen several violent confrontations between European colonizers and the core of this caravan trade complex. So relocating the hubs of the central line was also a means of sidelining political and commercial competitors. By zooming in on the railway, we can discern that its construction was a colonizing project, in the sense that it was not only a project by the colonial administration, but it was inherently a tool of colonization. It was used to colonize. So I do not call it a colonial, but a colonizing project. It had to serve the exploitation of the free trade zone in the Congo. It had to contribute to the territorial integration of German East Africa. It had to marginalize the main commercial competitors and political opponents of German colonization. And on top of all this, a railway company was founded and paid with the entitlement to grab land, which is also part of colonization. So according to the notorious adage that Africans had to pay for their own colonization, the German imperial government delegated the task of constructing the railway to the Ostafrikanische Eisenbahngesellschaft, the East African Railway Company, you could translate it. And the government budget did not finance the construction of the railway, but instead gave the company the right to gain full property of, now listen carefully, 2,000 hectares of land per 1 kilometer of track. Free to choose wherever they wanted in a range of 100 kilometers north and south of the track. The central line from Dar es Salaam to Kigoma, at the end of construction, had a length of roughly 1,250 kilometers, which means that the company was entitled to 2.5 million hectares or 25,000 square kilometers of landed property. There were a few restrictions. If they picked land within a range of 3 kilometers north and south of the railway line, there was limitation. They could not take more than 3 kilometers in a row. So there were, when it's very close. And there was also the restriction that they could not pick already recognized property of others, which included agricultural land that was in operation. They could not take that because that was considered property. But apart from that, they could take what they wanted. So they, of course, I preferably took land which was rich in minerals or otherwise promising, have a promising productivity, or lands that they needed to fuel their trains. That's also an element in that reasoning. A further indication of another nature than this land grabbing nature, another further indication that the railway construction was a colonial and imperial project can be seen in the monumentality of constructions along that line. The terminal station in Kigoma is here. accompanied by equally monumental hotels like this Kaiserhof in Kigoma, which was planned, intended to host the German emperor, the German Kaiser, for the formal inauguration of the railway, which was planned for August 1914. An informal inauguration ceremony had already taken place with local officials on Tuesday, the 30th of June, 1914, incidentally, 2 days after the heir of the Austro-Hungarian throne had been shot in Sarajevo. We all know what this led to, and this has already been given away. Irony and history go together well, as in the case of the Iron Road in Germany, East Africa. The Kaiser never visited the Kaiserhof hotels in Kigoma. There was one in Tabora as well. The Oost-Afrikanische Eisenbahngesellschaft never benefited from the lands they were allowed to grab. But this does not alter the fundamentally colonizing character of the construction of the railway per se. It's not just used for colonization, it's meant for colonization. A further irony is the motor vessel Gudson, which was built on a wharf in northwest Germany, disassembled, shipped to Dar es Salaam, transported by train to Kigoma, and reassembled in Kigoma, which was released on Lake Tanganyika in June 1915. Yet instead of enabling shiploads of copper ore or cowhides to be transported from the Congo or from Rwanda and Burundi, the Gudson's maiden trip, Rwanda and Burundi, at that time still part of Germany, East Africa, not after the war anymore. The Gudson's maiden trip was heavily armed with cannons and on a mission to militarily dominate the lake. 1 year later, 1916, the Germans scuttled this brand new ship, which was the largest freshwater ship in Africa at the time, in order to avoid that it would fall into enemy hands, while Congolese troops under Belgian and British command were about to seize Kigoma. It makes sense to see this vessel as part of the railway infrastructure. It was operated by the same company that also operated the railway in German times, but also afterwards. Until the end of the 20th century, it was the operation of the railway and the operation of the ship, the navigation on the lake, was done by the same company. Because as the ship has been recovered, it had been scuttled by the Germans, but controlled scuttling so that it could be recovered. The British recovered it in the 1920s, and it is still in operation today. In 1997, the Marine Service has been disconnected from the railway corporation, but the Liemba, as it is now called, it was called Gudson in the beginning. It's been renamed Liemba because Gudson is a German colonial governor, which just did not seem appropriate to continue to be the name. It's actually funny, if you are on the ship, there are still components where the Gudson is written on. So it's still operational, and it still is the largest ship on that lake. It's not the largest ship in Africa anymore, but it's the largest one on the lake. So these 3/4 of a century where the ship has been on the lake until it was separated from the railway can also be seen as a Belgian period in Kigoma. There's a Belgian connection to that, because the railway was, to some extent, the operation of the port of Kigoma and Dar es Salaam, but to some extent also the railway was very closely connected to Belgian colonial rule, although the train ran through British ruled Tanganyika at the time. So strictly speaking, the operation of the railway has never been Belgian. Let that be clear. No misunderstanding. The Belgians did not operate the railway, but because of the Belgian military occupation of, at some point, 1/3 of the territory of Germany, East Africa, including the area between Lakes Victoria and Tanganyika, Belgium was compensated when it retreated from most of this territory and left it to the British Empire. Most of you probably know that Rwanda and Burundi remained under Belgian colonial rule under a mandate of the League of Nations, but Belgium also received concessions in the harbors of Dar es Salaam and Kigoma for 1 symbolic franc per year, as well as the privilege to ship goods between these two ports free of customs and other charges or duties. They had to pay the travel cost, but no other charges or custom duties. So, and until the end of the colonial period, around 90% of the goods transported via the central line were quote unquote Belgian, meaning coming from the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. It was Belgium who had the concessions. The kingdom of Belgians had the concession, not Belgian Congo. So upon signing the Anglo-Belgian agreement back in 1921, the Governor General of the Belgian Congo, which was Maurice Leppens at the time, wrote to the Minister of Colonies, les Anglais se rendent compte que Kigoma n'a d'intérêt que pour nous. The English realized that Kigoma is only of interest for us. And as a matter of fact, as far as the transportation of goods is concerned, so I'm not talking about passengers now, I'm talking about goods, transportation of goods, this assessment that could be extended to the railway as a whole. The railway as a whole was more used for transportation in the interest of the Belgians than in the interest of the British throughout the colonial period. And ironically, even after flag independence of all countries concerned, which is Congo, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, who then at the moment of independence inherited legally this Anglo-Belgian agreement, the Belgian private company who operated these harbors in Kigoma and Dar es Salaam continued these operations until 1996, yes, 1996, still free of customs and other duties. So it continued to be operated by a private, but still Belgian company until the end of the 1990s. However, by then, the high days of traffic on the central line were already over. For the mineral-rich Katanga, there were more convenient and faster connections to the Atlantic and Indian Oceans already since around 1930. On top of that, in the 1970s, you may have seen it in the initial map. On the initial map, the first map I showed, it will come back, this map. In the 1970s, a further rail connection was constructed, connecting the copper-rich Copper Belt and Katanga region with Dar es Salaam, but via another route as the central line, meant to avoid, at that moment in the 1970s, the war-ridden trajectories via Angola and Mozambique, and at the same time avoiding the trajectories going through apartheid, Zimbabwe and South Africa. So avoiding these wars and politically unwanted regimes to the east, west and south, there was a new railway connection constructed, sponsored by China, directly connecting Zambia with Dar es Salaam, the Tazara line, which could also be used for goods coming from Katanga. So this Tazara line is another element that makes the central line less interesting to use for the transportation of goods. So this means that the central line lost relevance on a continental or global scale even, which was reflected also in the neglect of the maintenance and a concomitant decay of the central line and of the locomotives riding that central line. For instance, a line intended to offer 3 back and forth journeys per week reduced its services to only 1 ride per week by the end of the 20th century. So gradually, the future of the railway, and perhaps even more so of the Liemba, this ship, seems to become fossilized into the nostalgia of heritage tourism. Especially for the Liemba, heritage initiatives have been promoted as a realistic and allegedly viable option in the past decade or so. Tourists see the train and boat trip on the centenarian Central Line and Liemba as a vintage experience, and even plans to turn the Liemba into an event location, or even disassembling it and shipping it back again to the wharf in Germany to become part of the company museum, have been developed and have been taken serious by people defending these scenarios. Yet, for the people living along the track, the line remains the backbone of their connectedness. Just like the equally decaying means of navigation on the lake remain the backbone of their connectedness for people living along the shores of Lake Tanganyika. And I want to turn to these people in the remainder of my talk. I start with the construction of the railway. Although here as well, the start of the construction should be contextualized by looking further back in time than when the construction started. Labor for the construction of the railway was recruited within German East Africa, which is different from in Kenya, where also labor was recruited from India to construct the railway. And we should keep in mind that parallel to these construction works, caravans continued to be the main infrastructure for long distance trade as long as the railway was not operational. So although the caravan trade complex as a political order had been defeated, caravans as means of transportation actually reached its peak in this same period. And porters also continued to be needed when the railway was finished, as I already said, in order to carry goods to and from railway stations that were only on some places and only along this one line. So this taken together means that construction laborers had to be recruited in parts of the colony that were not involved in this caravan porterage, because this caravan porterage was still active and still growing at the time. So they had to recruit laborers further away from the railway line. Also construction workers who would build other constructions needed for the railway. It's not only the railway tracks itself, there's more needed. These had to be recruited further away. So the German colonial administration forcefully mobilized, especially on mainly only male labor from all over the territory, thus leaving agriculture in their region of origins to women in their villages, or should I say, in their homesteads. It turns out that the construction of the railway not only redefined the spatial constellations and connections around the track itself, but indirectly affected the spatial organization of rural areas far away from the railway. If we go a little further back in time, Southern and Eastern Africa experienced a massive movement of people from south to north before colonization took off, because before colonization in the area took off. It was already, could already speak of colonization in some coastal areas or in the south of Africa, but not in the area. So I will not go into the details of this movement, but it is ascribed to Zulu state formation. Some people may have heard of Shaka Zulu. It's that period you talk about, and his rise to power caused movement of people which moved as far north as present-day Tanzania. This movement of people caused political disorder and in East Africa itself. And the long-term fallout of this invasion intermingled with practices within the caravan trade complex. But that's a story that would lead us too far. What I do want to highlight is that rural communities modified their settlement patterns as a defensive strategy against these Nguni, as they are called, forces coming from the south in the middle of the 19th century. For the sake of agriculture, it was most effective to live in homesteads in the direct proximity to the fields. But for military strategic or defensive reasons against these forces from the south, it was more secure to regroup in larger settlements and thus being capable to better defending villages. It turns out that the construction of the railway and the removal of a large number of male labor from these areas made the women return to the fields and to a more scattered settlement pattern in these rural areas. So this is an example of how the railway affected faraway spaces and practices indirectly, and in perhaps counterintuitive ways The railway not only incited concentration of people or urbanization, it also triggered the exact opposite, scattering of living patterns in these rural areas where women were left alone or where few men were left, and agricultural logic took over from military strategic settlement patterns before. This is interesting in another reason, in longer term, because the first Tanzanian president, Julius Nyerere, launched a policy of villagization in the 1960s, known under the name Ujamaa policy, intent on regrouping rural communities. This was supposed to facilitate the provision of services like education, healthcare, and electricity to large groups of people living in larger settlements. But this, again, as in the 19th century, increased the distance from the fields, thus causing lower yields in agriculture, something the female peasants had been aware of more than half a century before Nyerere's Ujamaa policy. So notwithstanding, urbanization obviously still is the more obvious corollary of the railway. I've been cheating here a little bit because that's not the central line, that's the Tazara line, but I like the picture. The most important and booming urban centers in Tanzania are all situated along the three now, Tazara included. Oh, there is a reason to show Tazara now. Along the three main railway lines in the country. One could, of course, also phrase that the other way around. Perhaps the railway has been built to connect these urban centers, but that's historically less correct. A few of these centers were already urbanized in the context of the caravan trade complex, but many more only became important urban centers because of the railway connection. And still others, for instance, Bagamoyo, dwindled as a consequence of being cut off from the railway. The railway attracted people who could make a living off the railway, for instance, by bringing their produce to the market at more competitive prices by having cheaper means of transportation. The same agricultural produce produced by farmers living close to the railway could be brought to the market at a lower price than produced further away from the railway track. So because it saved transportation costs. They could also use the railway to move themselves as mobile labor. The railway has been used for labor migration, for forced labor migration, but also for voluntary labor migration or urbanization to places where workforce was in demand or thought that there would be work there. Or, as you can see in the picture, by using the train passing by as a regular mobile market, which a market 3 times per week, where goods could be bought and sold through the windows of the train. Some people even use the train journey to buy in one station stuff that is on offer in that area and sell it again further down their journey in another area where these goods are less available. So this is also one way how the railway is used by local people. The railway, on top of that, has also been a carrier of ideas. My 40 minutes are actually over. I'm almost there. The railway has also been a carrier of ideas, spreading religious reforms, spreading music styles, channeling sporting tournaments, or channeling also artists using the railway for tours. And it has also been used as the backbone for the decolonization movement in the 1950s sense of the word. So the hotspots of the political movement towards flag independence were situated along the 2 railway lines existing at that time. Tazara did not yet exist. Important political rallies were more often than not centered on railway towns and more particularly around the railway stations in those towns. Let me come to a conclusion. The track I used as a thread through my story is called the Central Line. Obviously, because the track ran through the center of the colonial, later national territory. Apart from Zentralbahn, the German colonialist also called the track Mittellandbahn, which makes it even more obvious that the adjective central refers to the central position on the map. Nothing more and nothing less in the name giving. However, I want to argue that the central line also sums up the spatial effects of the railway on the area it runs through. The railway was not just in the center, but created centrality. The central line drew a line through the territory, which, because of the relatively fast and high capacity connection it established, became the center. So I think that central line can be turned around. It creates a central line, a line of centrality. Being close to the railway meant being well connected or being central. Yet being far away from the railway meant having bad connection or being peripheral. The railway thus only produced a rather narrow strip of connectedness. At the same time, it also provoked spatial inequalities, disconnectedness for other places, and peripheralization for areas and for people who did not have easy access to the railway, either because they lived too far away or because they could not afford to use it. This central line, however, is not so central any longer in this sense of the word. On a global scale, disclosing Central Africa seems not as strategically important than it seemed in the late 19th century during the scramble for Africa. And as far as Central Africa still is of strategic importance, for instance, for raw materials from East Congo or the Zambian copper belt, other infrastructural links are used. I mentioned them before. And they continue to offer, or these alternatives continue to offer more attractive connections to the oceans. On a regional scale, within the area served by the central line, traveling and transportation is also redirected away from the central line. People in, for instance, Kigoma, where I did my field research, who need to travel to Tabora or Dar es Salaam, rather take the bus, which is cheaper, more flexible, and running more frequently than the train. Moreover, the bus can serve locations that are not connected by the railway. Another example, people working for international organizations, of which there are many in that area because of the huge number of refugees, or businessmen, government officials, international tourists as well, rather take the plane if it is not for the heritage experience of the 100-year-old train, which is faster and more comfortable. So only for its capacity in transporting huge loads, the train still has a comparative advantage. But then again, a new standard gauge railway parallel to the centenarian central line is under construction and will probably soon make the old central line obsolete. The new line, however, only covers the track from Dar es Salaam via Tabora to Mwanza, with an envisaged extension towards Rwanda, which is again on the table. The area west of Tabora and the connection with East Congo via that track, which was the cardinal artery of the central line a century ago, will not be served by the new standard gauge railway. And if we can expect similar policy decisions along the new track, as has been the case along the Tazara line, which has been brilliantly studied by Jamie Monson, it is to be expected that the new line will only serve the main cities, thus relatively disconnecting also many smaller places and people living there, lying between Dar es Salaam and Mwanza. Alternative technologies, economic imperatives, political decisions, and dynamics on larger scales seem to produce a similar fate for the central line as colonization and its back then state-of-the-art technology of railways has done with the caravan trade complex. The central line is on the verge of becoming a peripheral line. Looking at this central line, however, continues to be a useful prism to gain insight in what is and has been going on in East Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geert. We will have time for questions after the next speaker, because I want to wrap up the question round together with, after the presentation of Chao Tayiana Maina, who is a digital heritage expert. Actually very happy that this EUROPALIA project made me aware of you, because I didn't know of you before. So it's really an extremely great pleasure to have you here. You made it. You almost missed the plane, but thanks to the very good care of Eva, it all worked out. So I'm very happy you're here. So Chao is using the digital tools to actually do, if I can say it like that, public history projects on the African continent. And so she's going to tell us how she used that to do something about the railroads. Chao, the floor is yours. I will open. So this is you. Yeah. This is the point, yes. Yep.
Just
and you can
minimize this a bit more.
Wait, yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi, it's very nice to be here. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Johan, to EUROPALIA, who very, Eva, you took the time to, to get me here. I have joined you from Nairobi, Kenya. It's a pleasure to be here. And finally, thank you to Geert for a very interesting keynote that does set the stage for what I'm about to talk about. Now, before this, Johan said that we're going to go for some drinks, and I thought he meant that everyone's going to be drinking wine and would be happy and smiling. So I was a bit disappointed when everyone ordered green tea, but I hope I hope that this goes well. So my talk today is titled "Take Photos of Me Instead." I work as a public historian. A lot of my work lies within the public domain, online, on social media. And in 2012, I began a very unexpected and unpredictable journey to document the railway stations along the Kenya-Uganda Railway, originally known as the Uganda Railway. Motivated in equal parts, really, by a rapidly changing socio-political landscape and an unbudging instinct, I traveled 600 miles over the course of 4 or so years to capture that which was seen and visible, yet was somehow forgotten. So it is this personal journey to find meaning in the railway and preserve the memory of what it represented that frames the context of my talk today. I will take you through past, present, and possibly future as I frame this individual quest for answers through a nation's search for grounding and identity. Shortly before I started this project in 2012, the government of Kenya, under the new or current president, Uhuru Kenyatta, had in 2010 announced plans to construct a brand new $1 million railway line in partnership with the Chinese government. This new railway was posited as a fresh start for Kenya, and it would run in some cases, parallel to the old railway line. Now, when I say old, I'm talking about the Uganda Railway that was constructed by the British colonial government between 1896 and 1901. This meant the fact that they were running parallel to each other meant that some of the older railway stations would be demolished to make way for the new railway. And so this was the beginning of my inspiration to document the stations before they were destroyed or demolished. So it is interesting at this point to also note that these parallel railway lines, despite being a century apart, also have very similar stories or histories. Now, as I said, the railway line is known as the Uganda Railway, despite the fact that majority of it exists in Kenya. It was named after where it was going, not where it was coming from. The line's construction begins at the port of Mombasa in Kenya in 1896. While the colonial government claimed to be acting in the best interests of the indigenous people, this could not have been further from the truth. The Uganda Railway is interesting to me because today I will look at it as not just a thing or an inanimate thing, but as, I don't know, a scar, a personality, or something that has life, because it has lived many lives within the period of its existence. And with many lives, many memories, many meanings that have danced really to the tune of different generations and different agents over time. So we begin with its first life. Mary Serumanga and several historians on the railway have noted that the route, the design, and the services of the Uganda Railway were determined exclusively by the needs of the imperial government, by foreign investors, and by the European settler community. A decade after the Treaty of Berlin, that saw European countries carve out Africa amongst themselves, countries such as Britain, Belgium, Germany, France scrambled to establish the sphere of influence. Now, what does it mean to establish the sphere of influence? Yeah. At this point, one of the main ways in which this sphere, so-called sphere of influence, was established was through proof of physical occupation. Railways were one of the primary ways in which this was done. So this is probably the early 1890s, and tens of thousands of Indian laborers are preparing to come to East Africa, specifically what is now Kenya, to build a British railway. This is very different from the Central Line, which was built using African labor. So at the same time as these laborers are preparing to journey across the ocean and come to East Africa to build a railway in a place that they have never been more or less conceptualized, indigenous community elders, priests, and spiritual leaders in Kenya predict the coming of a long winding serpent that would crawl along the ground, shriek and puff smoke, bringing with it unimaginable loss. Now, it is from this kind of prophecies of community leaders and spiritual leaders that the name Iron Snake is born. So the railway is effectively coined as an iron snake. So at its inception, really, the railway represented not just the stamp of the colonial encounter, but the point at which the entire trajectory of a people would change. To give you an idea of the kind of conditions that people are working in, Indian laborers were paid 14 pence a day, whereas Africans who were employed to work on the railway were paid 4 pence a day. The argument from the colonial government was that it was easier to bring in Indian laborers because, one, that they had experience building railways in India, but at the same time, and I find this very curious, the fact that the laborers who are free men, the Africans in their own territories, could easily go home if they were not happy with the conditions. They could leave. And so the argument was that and I'll read this quote, the laborers being free men with no rent to pay and with gardens around their huts are not compelled to labor. What settles the price of labor, being why it makes sense for Indian laborers to be paid higher, is that a man cannot retire to his garden and his hut and wait until the employer must have him at his own price. He would starve. Therefore, he must make best with the terms that he has. And so this is the kind of context that is playing out at this time. So through hastily drafted laws, and Geert has already touched on this, and ordinances, a lot of land was allocated for railway use. Thousands of people lost their land and were pushed into native reserves, such as the Maasai people who were robbed of great chunks of their country. The promise of civilization, of progress, justified the eradication, the destruction, and the dissemination of anything that stood in its way. With this belief, the railway snaked through 600 miles of hills, plains, plateaus, and valleys, eventually arriving at its final destination, Lake Victoria, in Kisumu in 1901. Now, the cost of the Kenya-Uganda Railway compared to railways in India was enormous. It was built at a cost of £8,500 per mile, and this is in 1900, whereas railways in India were being built at the cost of £6,500 per mile. To the European population in the East Africa Protectorate, as it was known, the railway symbolized a point of triumph over this African wild that many people had described as uninhabited, which I will come to later. But to the indigenous population that witnessed the loss of the land, wealth, and the people, the line symbolized pain, not just during its construction, but after. This is something that has been said over and over again, that infrastructure such as this was not free. It was not a benevolent act freely given to the African people. If anything, the colonies had to pay back what was invested in this railway. They paid it back in form of land, in form of hard tax, in form of European settlers being invited to take huge pieces of land and farm. So the native, for example, in Uganda, or the indigenous population, had to raise a hard tax of about 10 cents. But to actually make that 10 cents, he or she had to carry a load of 60 pounds for 40 miles. And he had to make 5 of these journeys. And this is very interesting because when we say that the railway was not built at all to benefit the indigenous population, what we are seeing is that people had to walk miles and miles just to get to railway stations, just to sell their produce. We can also see the ways in which the railway was used after. Africans were required to sit in separate wagons, third class, use different toilets, and not even allowed in the dining areas. And so we journey from the 1900s, 1920s to the 1950s. And this brings me to really the second life. Here I'll be talking about myths, I'll be talking about memory, and I'll be talking about meaning. Towards the 1950s, as Kenya geared up towards independence, many positions within the railway workforce began to be Africanized. The railway line became a thread that tied together different ethnic communities, spawning a nation. In a newspaper interview, Kenyan author Peter Kimani describes it in this way. The railway line created something new, a tapestry of townships hewn from the train stations, needing a beadwork that formed modern Kenya. Renowned Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o also says that the railway is that event in history that constructed a common identity, an identity that united the patchwork of territories, people, and cultures into a national whole. Now, I like to talk about these two meanings because it is important really to understand the ways in which this infrastructure symbolizes different things to different generations at different times. The fierce resistance and anger of its early days dissipate into a more stalwart recognition of the railway as really the birth of Kenya. Here, this is actually a map that shows all the railway stations along the Uganda Railway. And it starts at Mombasa, ending up at here, Lake Victoria. What's interesting is that all the branch lines that are constructed really end up serving areas that had high numbers of European settlers. So they just end in towns like Nanyuki, Thompson's Falls, Kitale, where we had European farms and a lot of squatters in agricultural production. But even if you look at the kind of population distribution in Kenya today, you're more likely to find that most people will live along these lines. So by 1955, East African Railways and Harbors Corporation had more than 56,000 permanent African staff and was the single largest employer in Kenya. At this point, as I said, most of the positions within the Railway Corporation have been Africanized. You have people working in the Navy as engineers, as secretaries, as along the whole line is basically having African people take up different positions. In Kenya's fight for independence, the railway is used by activists and political agitators to mobilize, to send information and supplies between freedom fighters, while at the same time, it is also used by the colonial government to transport thousands of detainees suspected of being part of the Mau Mau movement, the freedom uprising, to detention camps all over the country. So this is an image of detainees being ferried using the railway. The nickname of this particular train was Gari ya Waya, which in Swahili translates to like the train of wires, or because you can see the barbed wire, the detainees are really not allowed to, or it was used to prevent detainees from escaping. We have the camp commander here and detainees lining up to get onto the train. And so here, this railway begins now to shift in meaning and perspective according, again, to the people who are using it, and really being subject to the forces of the politics that are happening at this time. Throughout this period, really, the railway enjoys a very prominent place in the lives of many, while creating multiple opportunities for trade, employment, and social interaction. It, however, begins to decline in the 1980s, 1990s due to poor management, among other factors, eventually falling into minimal use in the 2000s. So by the time Chao is coming along in 2016, 2013, most of the stations are dilapidated, are in disrepair, and the railway is not functioning in most parts. The journey that I embarked on in 2012, as I said, was really motivated, one, by the need to document infrastructure that was going to be demolished. But at the same time, what started as a journey to document stations really ended up being a journey to document, the stories of people, to understand what Kenyans remembered of the railway, to understand what it meant, what people lost, and what people even gained. And so this is the earliest, or the first station at the port of Mombasa in 2012. This is Savo Station, where if you've heard of the infamous man-eating lions, I do not want to spend time talking about them because literally everyone who talks about the Uganda Railway talks about the lions. And one of my problems with that argument is the fact that so much happened after these lions, but they have been used as a focal point for the history of this railway. But this is Savo Station, where you have this encounter with the man-eating lions. We have another station in Mombasa. And so I moved around the country, literally just taking photographs, speaking to people, interviewing people, and trying to understand what remains and what has been lost. Now, the third kind of life that this railway lives is in the 2000s. And here I talk about parallel lines and parallel histories. Now, I've moved you from the 1990s and 1980s, and we fast forward to 2017, when President Uhuru Kenyatta heralds the new standard gauge railway as a new chapter in Kenya's history, a history that was started 122 years ago when the British kicked off the train to nowhere. And I want you to actually spend some time thinking about this term, nowhere. What does it mean to describe a place as nowhere? What context are we using? What are we referencing? Is it that it doesn't have enough people? It doesn't have enough structures? Like, how do we determine that a place is actually nowhere? And here the Uganda Railway begins its third life, as a historical symbol of sorts that is used as a backdrop to cement political interests and to create the illusion of moving away from the colonial period, but also independence in a way. So, if the 3 lives of the Uganda Railway show us anything, it is that the historical memory is constantly evolving. Memory in itself is as much a new thing as it is an old one. And the question for me as a historian, also as a Kenyan, becomes, how then do you frame these multiple meanings and document these memories? My work to capture the memories of the Uganda Railway saw me visit more than 50 stations across the country, documenting them through photography, videography, online engagement, etc., some mapping as well. As I said, what started out as a journey to document infrastructure really ended up revealing a much more pressing need to document what Kenyans felt, experienced, and remembered about the railway. A perspective that history books had shunned or not adequately captured. And the dominant history of the railway was the history of its construction, the romantic European endeavor with man-eating lions that opened up a country. So basically, life one. Yeah, so that's where sort of the historical narrative is mostly centered. What I found along my journey actually was that the people in Kenya related to the railway in different ways. Here we look at memory, we look at meaning, and we look at motive. And for me, this is a very interesting place to share the kind of perspectives that were shared with me, but also, you know, the ways in which this project really opened up my eyes in a personal capacity. So between Mombasa and Nairobi, Mombasa being the start and Nairobi being, if you can sort of picture this at the center of the country, the SGR construction, SGR is the new railway that was being built, had already begun. So between this section, people were almost resigned to the fact that the railway was no longer functioning. When I talked about documenting it, when I talked about as a historical thing, people pretty much were in agreement. And yeah, you know, you can take photos, you can do this, you can do that. There was a sense of goodbye. You know, the new railway is coming. So this serves as a historical project. So it is this kind of section that also frames the title of today's talk, because while I was at this station, Taveta, near the border of Kenya and Tanzania, a passerby asked me, I'll translate it from Swahili. He said, "Why are you taking photos of these useless things? You know, take a photo of me instead." Yeah, and that frames really my title today. But that comment really struck me because, you know, I was there thinking, you know, I need to document this, and you know, things are going, things are changing, and there were places in Kenya where people didn't even not regard the stations, but to them they were no more than things that had served their time. Yeah. Between Nairobi and Nakuru is sort of like the Rift Valley and the kind of central part of Kenya. In 2007, this was an area that experienced post-election violence. There were very many ethnic clashes, and a lot of people died. And this area is also very, how do I say this, cosmopolitan in the sense that you have people from different communities residing together in different urban spaces. What was interesting about this section was that between these two stations, maybe 10 stations or so, people would always ask for my tribe before they gave me access to the, you know, I would show up with my letter, with my camera, and say I'm going to take them to this station. And people would say, "What's your last name?" Because that's in Kenya is another way of saying, which tribe are you? Yeah. And that for me was interesting because it was a gateway into the kind of social understanding of the people, that despite the fact that, you know, these stations, many of them are not being used, people are still protective of them, not from like a nationalistic Kenyan perspective, but from like I'll only let you in if I trust you. And my trust is based on, ethnic lines or ethnic boundaries. As you approach the lake, Kisumu, where the railway is terminating, this is Western Kenya. This was the most interesting part for me because in Western Kenya, the new railway had not even begun to be constructed, and it still hasn't. And Western Kenya is actually an agricultural hotbed in terms of a lot of agricultural production, sugarcane, sugar, rice, agricultural produce comes from Western Kenya. Now, at this point, the railway was used after independence to transport goods to Nairobi for very many farmers. So in Western Kenya, people were not looking at the railway as a historical thing. When I said I'm taking this to document, for them, when I showed up with a camera to them, it was, is the government reviving these stations? That was the first thing they thought. No one thought these stations are being documented because they're history now. So they were still living things. The railway was still a living thing that was not a historical symbol, but instead a symbol of the government's failure to invest in the Western Kenya region. And there were still hopes that it would come back. So this was kind of my journey across Kenya at the time, documenting the stations, learning more about what people felt. At the same time, I was also collecting a lot of social media and speaking with people, doing talks, and just understanding how people remember the railway in Nairobi in different parts. Now, my work demonstrated to me one thing, that we have to make room for contested memories. We have to make room for alternative meanings as well. The singular narrative, as Chimamanda puts it, is incredibly dangerous, but it's also very seductive to fall into. The trap of assigning one point in history or one narrative to such a huge and complex thing as the railway. Now, the output of this work culminated really in an online platform, which is, and also some call a website, but it's more complex to call it a platform, that showcases the photographs, interviews, and experiences that I documented along the way. And this was the last station I photographed was in, I would say 2016, 2017. Now, my hope is that this work really symbolizes a point in time which someone else can build on and can reveal another layer of meaning. There is a place for digital technologies, I truly believe, as a digital historian, in allowing a kind of freedom to explore and exist outside the boundaries of memory or dominant narratives, to question that which has gone unquestioned or unchanged for a very long time. And remember when I told you to keep in mind the word nowhere? Yeah. Who remembers? Yeah. Okay. We're there now. So this new railway that was launched in 2017 is now called the Railway to Nowhere. Why? Because due to resource and financing challenges, the standard gauge railway is now referred to as a white elephant due to certain complications. Originally intended to reach Uganda, the railway now terminates, or Uganda basically pulled out of their end of the agreement. And so there was the money to extend the railway until Uganda has not yet been found. I think that I hear that there are talks, but for now, the railway terminates in this town called Suswa, which is in Maasai Land. Before the railway, many Kenyans did not know of this town. Yeah, my friends did not know of this town. It really was a small place, a remote town with a very small population. But you can see literally that it ends somewhere. But this is Suswa town. This is the town. Yeah. So this kind of railway to nowhere tag really seems to have stung the president, because in an address in, I think, 2019, he said, "Let me tell you, Suswa is not nowhere. The town is called Suswa. This is Kenya. Whether you like it or not, once I am done with my work and I go home after 20 years, or when I come back here, Suswa will be more developed than Nairobi." Now this is like echoing, yeah, you laugh, but it's true. This is echoing, I don't have a photograph of Nairobi when the railway arrived, but he's echoing, you know, this kind of idea that the railway in itself built Nairobi, built Kenya as a whole. As I said, prior to coming of the railway, Suswa is a really small town, but it's also my ancestral land. As a child, I spent many days with my grandparents around the town playing, you know, this was home. And one evening recently, actually, I asked my grandfather, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this railway being called the railway to nowhere? Because it terminates in Suswa. And he told me, you know, Chao, that even nowhere is somewhere to someone. Yeah. And so really this journey for me, in as much as I haven't worked on it in a few years, framed the work that I went on to do, or that I still do to this day, looking at public history, looking at memory in Kenya, looking at infrastructure. And it did give me a lot. It did give me a lot in terms of what I work with. So yeah, this is my talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chao. We do have some time for questions. If you're not completely exhausted by now, no, I see people still. So are there any questions for either Geert or Chao, or not for us? You can ask the questions to us when we walk into the exhibition. So any questions? Because if not, we can all go upstairs and we can also have informal chats. Maybe that's a more convenient format to ask questions. So if there, and I'm looking at the chat is silent, I suppose, Robby? Yes, Robby says the chat is silent, so I believe him. Is there, oh, we have a question. Oh, we have two. Oh, let's, okay, stop sharing and see what the questions are. Hopefully not too difficult questions. Okay. You're welcome. So basically we can do the informal format and go upstairs, but I do want to give a word of thanks before we close this evening. So basically this has been quite a journey. I mean, I always say I don't want to do large projects anymore, and I thought this was a small project, and then it turned out to be a very big project, very time-consuming. But I mean, it has been an opportunity to discover a whole bunch of new people. So first, thanks to the EUROPALIA team, Dirk and Eva. It was really fantastic to work with you. I mean, what an engagement and commitment for this project. This was really great. It's also my first encounter actually with Anne, so also that's for me it's a very important encounter with Arnaud and Alexandre, who are the artists in residence, but Christine, who have a long history with from the museum. So we also meet old friends doing these kinds of projects. So that's the first. The second thanks goes out to the Van den Hove, the place where we are, our venue, which is basically a place that was, you could say, invented by Bart Verschaffel, who thought that we needed a kind of tool to show student work, to work and do kind of curatorial work with students. So he made this possible and basically allowed our department basically to use this space as a kind of, to do these kinds of events. And but also Geert, who you actually saw at sitting at the entry, but who is like a key person for not only for this place, but also for the department. So thank you, Geert, for always being there and always being available, even if I call at impossible moments of the day. and night. And Bram van der Ver, who actually who did a lot of technical support for setting up the exhibition, and who brought many laughter to setting up the exhibition actually. So it was not only his technical skills, but basically making it a pleasant journey. I have to thank what the French would call les bailleurs de fonds, so the people who finance this. I mean, EUROPALIA is a very important stakeholder here, but also we got funding from the Global Minds Funds of Ghent University, and so apparently I also say thank you here to the VIR UOS, because they are actually giving the money to the Ghent University, and then we tapped into that kind of funding scheme. And then we basically put some money in of ourselves and research money that we have. And then basically people granted permission to use material. So we have been very privileged to have like very good working relationships with the people of our stakeholders at both the AfricaMuseum and Tervuren, but also the State Archives. So Guido Grezeels, the director of the AfricaMuseum, is someone who gives us a lot of trust and basically said it's okay, you can use a material of our collections. But also Pierre-Alain Tallier, who is responsible for the Africa collections of the State Archives and the former archives of the Ministry of Colonies, very quickly responded to my request if we could use material for free. And he said, okay, but just make publicity for the State Archive. So Pierre-Alain, here is great collections in the State Archives. Everybody has to go there. Ghent University lent some books, and then researchers that basically gave input to the work of that you will see above. So Bernard Tollier, who is here, who is an expert on the Congo-Ocean railway line, and we had a great session this morning with Alexandre and Arnaud. Geert, of course, who was very important for us, but also Ana Vashmilero from Lisbon and Philippa Fusa, who are doing research on Angolan and Mozambican railway lines, came to the seminar and gave input, and Friedrich Anleiter, a German historian, gave input for the Southern Line. And Bas Lecoq, who has this reading group on transport history, we basically picked 3 people of the group for tomorrow's conference. So Bas was also very important for this whole Trains and Tracks in Africa project. Students who basically co-curated the whole exhibit that you will see in a moment. So Jana and Finn and Jona, thanks for doing this work and being so engaged in this project. And then students who participated in the seminar, we have, I mean, you need to be aware that we train engineer architects. So you can say, okay, what are engineer architects doing with this kind of research? We have the advantage of having very open-minded, very engaged, committed students who can work hard, which is good because we are a bit like slave traders sometimes. But so we really can produce really fantastic work with students. And so really thanks to the guys who basically participated in the seminar. So I'm not going to give the full names, but still the first name. So Yona, Abdul Malik, Tom, Anse, Josephine, Manu, Chiara, Arne, Gust, Eli, Marte, Inike, Theo, Cuny, Julie, Kevin, Jens, and Leah all participated and all really did a great job. One person to thank for me, sitting here in front of me, a PhD candidate of mine, who, and I really say I'm a slave trader, so he knows. Because if Dirk said, and he wonders sometimes when do I sleep, that's basically because I'm on the chat with Robby, discussing what we need to do last minute for the different projects that we're running. So Robby, thank you for doing this. He's also the guy who in one day produced this really nice leaflet. You can take one home. So they are upstairs. So it's been really a privilege to work with these people. And so thank you to everyone. Thank you all for being here, also online. And so let's go upstairs. And there's no reception, so the people who follow online won't miss anything in that sense. But it's also because we ran out of money, basically. No, it's because we want to see the exhibition and then go into the city. Okay, thank you very much.